Sadly, Cuba's most prominent export these days is not cigars or rum, it's oppression. Détente with the regime has failed. Cozying up to Cuban dictators will always be a black mark on this great nation's long record of defending human rights. For these reasons, I'm announcing that the Trump administration will no longer suspend Title III. Effective May 2nd, the right to bring an action under Title III of the Libertad Act will be implemented in full. I have already informed Congress of my decision. Implementing my Title III in full means a chance at justice for Cuban Americans who have long sought relief for Fidel Castro and his lackeys seizing property without compensation. For the first time, claimants were able to bring lawsuits against persons trafficking in property that was confiscated by the Cuban regime. Any person or company doing business in Cuba should heed this announcement. In addition to being newly vulnerable to lawsuits, they could be abetting the Cuban regime's abuses of its own people. Those doing business in Cuba should fully investigate whether they are connected to property stolen in service of a failed communist experiment. I encourage our friends and allies alike to likewise follow our lead and stand with the Cuban people. Today, we are holding the Cuban government accountable for seizing American assets. We are helping those whom the regime has robbed get compensation for their rightful property. And we're advancing human rights and democracy on behalf of the Cuban people.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone.
Let's start with Matt.
Thank you.
That obviously we've been in very deep and close contact with our allies in Europe and Canada and around the world as we consulted on this decision over the past several months as the Secretary had been shortening the period of suspension with his previous decisions. I think it's clear if you look in the macro sense, we have broad agreement with our allies in Europe and Canada and around the world on the policy objective, which is to promote democracy in Cuba and to free the Cuban people from the tyranny that they live under. We are in broad agreement on this. Where we sometimes disagree is on the best way to achieve that. And I think, at the end of the day, you'll need to speak to the European Union and to our allies as to what response they will have. But I would like to emphasize that European companies that are operating in Cuba will have nothing to worry about if they are not operating on property that was stolen from Americans post-revolution. So I think the vast number of European companies will not have any concerns operating in Cuba.
Cutting off any funds to Maduro.
I mean, I would defer you to the Europeans for their response. They certainly, we took a decision today based on our laws and our sovereign concerns for the property of American citizens, and the Europeans will respond as they see fit, and we'll continue to work closely with them on this policy and on the policy in Venezuela.
Thank you. How much further is the administration? Is this a trajectory that you see continuing?
I think you're going to be seeing quite a bit more from us, and that this is the beginning of a new process on this that recognizes the reality on the ground in Cuba, which is in the past 20-plus years, the underlying reality in Cuba has not changed for the average Cuban.
Nick.
Specifically with any U.S. company that is doing business in Cuba?
There will not be any exemptions.